There is a number that explains the next 12 months of this war better than any battlefield map, any drone strike footage, any satellite image of burning tanks. The number is 45. That was the price, in US dollars, of a barrel of Russian Urals crude oil in February 2026. It was the lowest price Russia had received for its flagship export since the pandemic emptied the roads and grounded the planes. At that price, the Kremlin's federal budget was not just strained, it was mathematically broken. Oil and gas revenues had collapsed by 47% compared to the year before. In January and February alone, Russia ran a deficit of 3.45 trillion rubles, $42 billion, which consumed 91% of the entire deficit target for the full year. In 2 months, the finance ministry was quietly asking agencies to identify 10% of spending for potential cuts. The National Wealth Fund, the emergency savings account Moscow has leaned on since the invasion, was being drained at a rate of nearly $5 billion every 60 days, and the liquid portion was already more than half gone. Internal government estimates made before the end of February projected the annual deficit could spiral to 3.5% to 4.5% of GDP, more than double what the budget law allowed. Russia, in plain fiscal terms, was heading toward the kind of crisis that does not end with a speech. It ends with a choice between paying soldiers and paying pensions. And then Donald Trump bombed Iran. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Within 72 hours, Iran responded by effectively shutting the Strait of Hormuz, the 21-mile passage through which roughly 20% of the world's oil and a quarter of its liquefied natural gas flows every day. Traffic collapsed from over 100 ships per day to nearly zero. Brent crude, which had been drifting below $70, blasted past 100 in 10 days and peaked at 126. The International Energy Agency called it the worst disruption to global energy supply since the 1970s. California gas stations crossed $5 a gallon. Iraq started shutting in oil fields because it had nowhere to store the crude it could no longer export. The global economy braced for recession. And 6,000 kilometers north of the Strait of Hormuz, in Moscow, something very quiet and very important happened. The price of Russian Urals crude, the barrel that funds the war, feeds the budget, and keeps the Kremlin's machinery turning, doubled. From roughly $45 in February to $90 by mid-March. In some transactions, Russian crude was selling above the global Brent benchmark for the first time in years. Indian refiners, desperate for supply as Middle Eastern cargoes vanished behind Iran's blockade, were suddenly paying premium prices for the same Russian oil they had been buying at record discounts just weeks earlier. The war that Washington launched partly to increase pressure on Russia's allies had, within 3 weeks, become the single largest financial gift the Kremlin has received since the invasion of Ukraine began. The arithmetic is not subtle. Every $10 increase in the monthly average price of Urals crude delivers approximately $1.6 billion in additional tax revenue to the Russian state. A $20 increase sustained for a month means an extra $3 billion. A $40 increase sustained for 6 months means $38 billion. Before the Iran war, the Kremlin was staring at a revenue gap that could have reached $50 to $60 billion over the full year. After it, analysts began running numbers that suggested Russia might not only close the gap, but actually meet its original budget targets. The same targets that every serious economist had declared fantasy by January. By late March, the Russian government had already quietly shelved its plans for spending cuts. It dropped discussions about downgrading its growth forecast. Internal estimates shifted from projecting a catastrophic deficit of nearly 4.5% of GDP to something closer to 1%, below the official target. Moscow did not announce this reversal with a press conference. It did not need to. The price of oil said everything. To understand why this paradox is so structurally dangerous, you need to see the two halves of the picture simultaneously. The first half is the damage. Russia's economy did not arrive at February 2026 in good shape. It arrived hollowed out, overheated, and structurally distorted by 4 years of war. Growth had stalled. The sugar rush from wartime military spending, which produced 4% GDP growth in 2023 and 2024, was over. The IMF forecast 1% growth for 2026. The Economic Forecasting Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences projected 0.7. The central bank's Business Climate Index dropped into negative territory in March for the first time since October 2022. Investment in fixed capital fell for the first time since the pandemic. Inflation, juiced by a VAT increase from 20 to 22%, remains stubborn enough to keep interest rates frozen at 15%. Borrowing was expensive, credit was tight. The civilian economy was suffocating, while the defense sector consumed everything: money, labor, materials, political oxygen. Sanctions had done real damage, just not the kind that produces a dramatic headline. The Urals Brent discount, which used to sit at $1 or $2 per barrel before the invasion, had blown out to $29 by February 2026. That gap represents billions in lost revenue on every tanker that sails. 640 Shadow Fleet vessels were sanctioned across the US, UK, and EU. India, under pressure from Washington, had cut Russian crude imports from 2 million barrels per day in October to 1.3 million in December. The EU banned refined products made from Russian crude starting January 21st, closing the refining loophole that had allowed Russian oil to reach European consumers through Indian and Turkish middlemen. Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, were directly sanctioned by the Trump administration, meaning any entity doing business with them risked being cut off from the American banking system. All of this was working, slowly, expensively, imperfectly, but working. The fiscal walls were closing in. Russia was being forced toward the kinds of choices that erode warfighting capacity: cut spending, raise taxes, drain reserves, or borrow at punishing rates from domestic lenders who were themselves under stress. The trajectory was toward genuine fiscal distress sometime in the second half of 2026. Not collapse, not revolution, but the kind of grinding, compounding pressure that makes maintaining a 1,000-kilometer front with daily casualty rates of 1,000 soldiers increasingly difficult to sustain. The Hormuz crisis did not reverse the structural damage. It interrupted the fiscal timeline. This is the second half of the picture, and it is the part that should worry anyone who wants the sanctions regime to work. What the oil price spike does is buy the Kremlin time, not health, time. Russia's economy is still stagnating. Its labor force is still depleted. Its civilian industries are still atrophying. Its technology base is still aging under sanctions that block access to advanced Western components. Its defense budget still consumes a share of GDP that would be considered reckless by any peacetime standard. None of that has changed. What has changed is the cash position. And in wartime economics, cash is time, and time is survival. Consider the mechanics. Russia's oil exports do not pass through the Strait of Hormuz. They move through Baltic ports, Black Sea terminals, and Pacific pipelines. When the strait closed, the countries that did depend on it, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, suddenly could not get their crude to market. Asian buyers, particularly China and India, pivoted to the oil that was still flowing, Russian oil. Demand surged, discounts evaporated. Chinese state-owned oil companies, which had paused purchases of Russian crude in late 2025 after new US sanctions, resumed buying. Indian refiners, who were supposed to be weaning off Russian supply under a deal with Trump, reversed course entirely. Russian shipments to India nearly doubled between February and March. In some weeks during March, Russia recorded the highest weekly oil export revenues since the first months of the invasion in 2022. The irony bites in layers. Washington sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil to squeeze Russian revenue. Then Washington bombed Iran, which closed Hormuz, which spiked global prices, which made Russian crude more valuable. Then Washington temporarily eased its own sanctions on Russian seaborne oil to prevent a global supply crisis. Then Indian refiners, who Trump had pressured to stop buying Russian crude, started paying above market prices for it because there was nowhere else to turn. The policy that was designed to starve the Kremlin's war chest ended up through a chain of second-order effects, filling it back up. And Moscow knows it. One analyst at a Russian think tank told independent media that the Kremlin's ideal scenario is not a resolution of the Hormuz crisis. It is a moderately prolonged conflict, long enough to keep prices elevated, short enough to avoid a global recession that would destroy demand. A sustained Hormuz disruption of 3 to 6 months at current price levels could deliver somewhere between $20 and $40 billion in windfall revenue. That is not enough to fix Russia's structural economic problems, but it is enough to fund another year of war. There is a deeper strategic dimension here that goes beyond the budget spreadsheet. The Hormuz crisis has rearranged the political economy of energy sanctions in ways that will be difficult to undo. Before the Iran war, the Western sanctions architecture against Russia relied on a simple premise: limit the price Russia receives per barrel, limit its ability to ship, and the revenue will decline. The price cap, the shadow fleet crackdowns, the insurance restrictions, the refining bans, all of these tools assumed a relatively stable global oil market in which Russian crude was a discounted commodity that buyers tolerated but did not need. The Hormuz closure destroyed that assumption. In a market where 20% of global supply is suddenly threatened, Russian crude is no longer a discount commodity. It is a strategic asset. Buyers do not just tolerate it, they chase it. And every diplomatic lever Washington had used to discourage purchases, the pressure on India, the sanctions on shippers, the targeting of intermediaries, loses force when the alternative is $5 gasoline and rationed fuel for Asian factories. The sanctions regime did not fail. It was overtaken by a larger crisis that the same government enforcing the sanctions helped create. This is not a theoretical concern. It is already visible in the data. The Urals Brent discount, which sanctions had widened to nearly $30, collapsed in March as global competition for non-Hormuz crude intensified. Some Russian cargoes were reportedly selling at a premium over Brent. That had not happened since before the invasion. It represents the single most damaging reversal for the sanctions architecture since the price cap was introduced in December 2022. Yet, the picture is not entirely bleak for those hoping sanctions pressure will eventually constrain Russia. The structural weaknesses remain. The oil price windfall flows into a budget that is spending 16.8 trillion rubles on defense and security, a figure so large that it crowds out everything else. The civilian economy is not recovering. It is adapting to permanent wartime conditions in ways that reduce long-term productivity. The labor market is exhausted. The central bank cannot cut interest rates because inflation is still elevated. Companies are not investing because borrowing is too expensive. The technological isolation imposed by export controls continues to erode the quality of Russian military equipment, even as quantity remains high. And the National Wealth Fund, even with higher oil prices, has been so depleted that it no longer functions as a meaningful buffer against future shocks. Moreover, the oil windfall is structurally fragile. If the Hormuz crisis resolves, through negotiation, through military action, or through the slow normalization of shipping routes, prices will fall, and they will fall into a market that was already oversupplied before the crisis began. OPEC Plus members have been increasing production targets. The World Bank had projected Brent at $60 for 2026 before the Iran war. A post-crisis correction could send Urals back toward $40, and Russia would find itself exactly where it was in February, only with higher spending commitments locked in, reserves further depleted, and the domestic economy in worse structural shape than before. The honest assessment is this: the Hormuz crisis has not saved Russia's economy. It has given the Kremlin a financial reprieve that postpones the fiscal reckoning without resolving any of the conditions that created it. Russia's war economy was running on fumes in February. It is now running on borrowed time funded by someone else's catastrophe. That is better than fumes, from Moscow's perspective. It is enough to maintain the front, pay the soldiers, keep the factories producing shells and drones. But it is not a foundation. It is a windfall, and windfalls end. The question that matters now is what happens when this one does. If the strait reopens and prices correct, Russia will face the same fiscal cliff it was approaching before, only steeper, because the budget will have been recalibrated around higher revenue assumptions. If the strait stays closed or partially closed for months, the windfall continues, but at the cost of a global recession that eventually depresses demand for the oil Russia is selling. Either way, the structural trajectory has not changed. It has only been delayed. And that delay has a cost that is measured not in rubles or barrels, but in lives. Every month the Kremlin can fund the war without making painful domestic choices is a month the war continues at its current intensity. 1,000 Russian casualties per day, Ukrainian cities under bombardment, a front line that grinds forward and backward across the same devastated landscape. The sanctions regime was designed to shorten this timeline by imposing accumulating fiscal pressure. The Hormuz crisis has lengthened it, not through any action by Russia, but through a cascade of consequences set in motion by a different war, in a different region, for different reasons. That may be the most unsettling part of this entire story. Nobody planned this. No strategist in Moscow engineered the Hormuz closure to rescue the Russian budget. No analyst in Washington modeled the second-order effects of bombing Iran on Russian oil revenues and concluded it was worth the trade-off. This is the machinery of global energy markets operating at a scale that dwarfs the intentions of any individual government. One choke point closes, and 6,000 kilometers away, a war that was slowly becoming unaffordable becomes affordable again. Not because anything on the battlefield changed, because the price on a screen moved. The Kremlin did not outmaneuver the West, it got lucky. And in a long war, luck can be as decisive as strategy, for a while. The question is whether the West can outlast Russia's luck the way it was outlasting Russia's money. Because the money was running out, the luck might last longer. Somewhere in the Russian finance ministry, an official who spent January preparing emergency spending cuts is now looking at a revenue projection that has doubled since February. Somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a tanker captain is sitting on 2 million barrels of crude that cannot move because Iran turned the world's most important waterway into a toll road. And somewhere between those two facts lies the most dangerous paradox of this war. The operation that was supposed to demonstrate American power in the Middle East has, as a side effect, extended Russia's ability to wage war in Europe. Nobody in Washington will say that out loud, but the spreadsheet already has.